It seems like a lot of people don't know how ridiculous the amount of albums the Beatles sold is, and I'm here to fix that. That's why in this video, we'll be looking at all 13 studio albums and we'll rank them from lowest to highest sales, just so you have a better idea of the numbers the band pulled. No surprises here, 1969's Yellow Submarine is at number 13 with 4.8 million copies sold, and honestly, out of those sales, 4 million were probably bought by collectors. This is by far the worst album by the band, if you can even call it an album, so the fact that the worst album by the band still has better sales than the best-selling album of most other bands really tells you something about the legacy of the Beatles. The band's debut is at number 12 with a mind-blowing 6.5 million copies sold, but the real number should be a lot higher. At this point, the Beatles released a US version that was marketed with a completely different name and cover, even though they were pretty much the same album. So if you were to count those sales, the number would probably be a lot higher, but there's no way to calculate that, so number 12 it is. At number 11, you have the band's sophomore release with 6.7 million copies, which once again would be a lot more if you count the US release. Actually, considering the fact that Meet the Beatles sold 7 million copies, this album should be a lot closer to the top 5, but it was marketed as a different album, so it stays at number 11. Cracking the top 10, we have 1964's Beatles for Sale with 6.8 million copies. Now, realistically, this album should be way lower, mainly because this album didn't have a proper US version. However, given the fact that this album was barely promoted, it was released right after a fan favorite like A Hard Day's Night, and most of the songs are covers, selling almost 7 million is still quite an achievement. We have quite a big jump here because at number 9 we have 1965's Help with 11.2 million copies sold. My god. This wasn't only a studio album, it was also the soundtrack for the second film of the band. It also had songs like Yesterday, the title track, and Ticket to Ride, and though US releases were still stalling the sales a little, 11 million is still an impressive number, especially since we're only at number 9. 1964's A Hard Day's Night comes in at number 8 with a very similar number to Help, 11.3 million copies sold. Unsurprisingly, since this is also a soundtrack and it also has some of the band's most recognizable songs like If I Fell and I Love Her and Can't Buy Me Love. Though this album was also released in the US, it was released alongside 5 other albums by the band, so maybe if the labels wouldn't have been so greedy we would have a much higher number on our hands, but that's not the case, so it stays in number 8. At number 7 we have what in my opinion is the most underrated album by the band, 1967's Magical Mystery Tour with 11.7 million copies. Quite a large number when you consider the fact that this wasn't even meant to be an album to begin with. 12 million is a number your top artists can only dream about, and the Beatles got it with an album that's half leftovers and half previously released singles. At number 6, we have an album that would probably be a lot lower if it weren't for the context in which it was released, 1970's Let It Be with 13.5 million copies sold. Released after the band's breakup was announced and labeled as the sound of the Beatles falling apart, as well as having songs like Let It Be and Across the Universe, is no wonder this album sold that much. Kinda feels like a low number when you consider everything that happened that year, but still, almost 14 million copies for a studio album is a ridiculous number.